I'm Zelda Cahill Davis Gilman. I've attracted a lot of names in my 90 years, haven't I? My family moved to Indian River in 1919 and had the choice of purchasing two different houses, each $500 apiece. The one was Tilly Tomlinson's, the first house across the bridge on the north side of the river, and the other was up near the Methodist Church. My mother rejected Tilly Tomlinson's because it was on the river, and she was afraid we kids would fall in, and that would have been too dangerous. The house we purchased was a square building with a shack attached to the back of it. Previously, the house had had much foliage around it, and the man who purchased it dug it all up, covered the yard with clay, and we didn't have to worry about a lawn for a while. To get into the house, you had to walk along the house on planks, because once you stepped off into the clay, you were stuck there. Inside the house, our furnace was an oil-burning furnace. Our kitchen stove used wood. Those two units kept the house warm enough for us for the winter time. We had an additional lot out the backyard that my mother used for farming, which I'll tell you about a little later. The man who owned the house, Mr. Goist, boarded with us. We bought the property at the back end of our lot from a Mrs. Hamper and built a barn on it because my mother wanted a cow or cows, and we had pigs, and my mother raised turkeys, and we had an excellent garden. In fact, she was a farm girl and didn't ever give it up. From the milk, we sold it to our neighbors, and we sold it to people down on Constance Park, which is also the bathing beach. I used to deliver milk down there in a coaster wagon that was partitioned off in squares to hold the milk bottles. And those people sort of supplied their own milk bottles, because when I took a bottle of milk to them, there was a clean one there to pick up. Milk was 12 cents a bottle. I got 2 cents, my mother got 10 cents, and I did this 5 or 6 days a week. Next door to us lived the Earl Fry family, whose son Emerson lived there eventually. And across the street from us was Mr. Fry's big garage, a 4-car garage. Also on that property was an ice house where the Frys put up ice in the wintertime and sold it to the resorters in the summertime. And Granddad and Grandma Fry built the house on that corner. Next door to Fry's was the McMillan family. McMillan was a doctor. I remember 3 children they had, a son Albert, a daughter Frida, and another daughter. The family finally moved to Charlevoix, where the doctor practiced. And I recall in my older days having seen Frida at retired teachers' meetings. Then next to the McMillan building was the old schoolhouse. So I was just 2.5 doors away from the schoolhouse. It was an interesting old building. It had what we called the little room, and in that Maud Coffey taught beginners through the 3rd grade, sometimes through the 4th grade. And in the middle room was Anna King, who taught middle grades 5, 6, 7, or 7 and 8. And in the big room, one year it was Jack Seeley. Later it was Hugo Nelson. Beyond the schoolhouse was the old Waterbury place. Mrs. Waterbury had several sisters in town. Mrs. John Hayner was one of them. Mrs. Clyde King was one of them. And Mrs. Waterbury had a fine porch around her place. I used to like to go up there and visit with her. Across the street from McMillan House is where the Shoebridges lived. They had two sons who were both in World War I, and they had a daughter, Catherine, who was about my age, who died when she was relatively young, 12 years old, I think. Now, across from the Fry's house was the Methodist Church. Not the building you see today, because the building has been enlarged. It was added on to the back toward the Shoebridges. It was added on to the front. But when it was a smaller one, it had rounded cement steps at the front of the building. And we kids used to go over there after electric lights were added in the river, about 1923. We used to go over and perform on those steps at night, tell stories we'd read to school or recite poems, or we'd play games. And sometimes Mrs. Fry would come over with marshmallows and give us a treat for entertaining people. After kids left the Indian River School, they went to other schools, Petoskey, Charlevoix, Sheboygan, because Indian River only went through the 10th grade. I remember going to Sheboygan High School, riding the train. I had to be up catch the train at 6 o'clock in the morning on Monday, rode up there and lived with the judge and his wife on Young Street. There were also some girls from Topnabee who lived at the same place. And Friday night, we'd come home on the train. When I got to Indian River on Friday night from having been on the train, no one was there to meet me. It was 10:30 at night. So I walked back up the railroad track to get to my house. Remember, there were no electric lights until late in the 20s. My brother went to Sheboygan High School, my brother Jim. My brother Luke went to Petoskey High School. And anyone related to the Dagwell family went to Charlevoix because Mrs. McMillan was one of the Dagwell girls. Trains were very interesting. We had 2 passenger trains north daily and 2 passenger trains south daily, and they came at appropriate times. The one in the morning was at 6 o'clock, the one at noon went south at 12:30, one came in the afternoon at 3:30, one went south at night at 10:30. The railroad agents were very interesting men. I remember Jim Bell, who had some grandchildren still living in Petoskey. I remember Mr. Ross. I remember Mr. Golding, who eventually moved down to Vanderbilt to live. When the train came in, Mr. Fry, Mr. Earl Fry, or Mr. Hopkey, or sometimes Jake Slaterline would be there. In the early days, they were there with a horse and a dray, and they hauled your luggage. Most of the people who came to Columbus Beach for the summer, and they had trunks. In fact, they didn't get off the train because the train put their sleeping car on the siding, and when they got ready, they could get up and get taken up to their place on Columbus Beach. The mail was taken from the depot in a push cart, and I can remember those men at various times, particularly after the 3:30 train, walking the length of town to go down to the post office, which was in the same building as Martin's Grocery. And people waited around until that mail got delivered and then picked it up and went off home. The old bridge that used to be across the Indian River was an iron bridge. And I remember one young man from the south side of town would run across that bridge, and he had to touch every one of the round poles on that bridge as he ran across. If he missed one, he went back and touched it again. I even remember one time when he put his tongue on one of those poles and pulled the skin right off of his tongue because it was freezing weather. Now, when that old bridge was replaced, the alternate bridge was put a little bit west on the river, about where the road turns to go to Columbus Beach, or where you go straight ahead to go to the golf course. And it was a wooden bridge, and it was there quite some time, as I recall. Over what became the golf course used to be a place where Harry Dagwell grazed his cattle. Sometimes we grazed ours there too, and then later, after the golf course was developed, we had to take our cows up the road about a half a mile into another grazing area. When we kids played out on the church steps, we knew when it was time to go home, even though we wanted to stay after it got dark, but we heard a bugle sound, and everyone at the first sound of the bugle took off for home. That was Charlie Eddy calling his kids, telling them it's time to get in now, you've been out long enough. And the whole side of Indian River, on our side of the river, took heed of that. Also on our side of the river, there were houses by the Big Martin house, was where Helen Martin eventually lived. Next to that was where the Pecks lived. They had a daughter named Susie. He married Orr Stanley, and they lived in that house for quite some time. And then at the corners where the Rogers lived, they were related to the Pecks. And then there was the Grandset house, and then Fay Martin's house. And across the street from Fay's house was Walter Eddy and Harry Eddy and Charlie Eddy, Amos Berry, and across from them was the Gardners who had moved here from Scotland. They had some young men who went to school in Indian River. I remember one of them married a Sheboygan girl, and they moved to Traverse City, and they had a son who has become a Catholic priest and serves the parish in Charlevoix now. And Mary Martin Hayner also just lived around the corner from Ian O'Berry's, and Roy Chambers lived down there, the Maybanks, and Frank Martin. The house that was next to the Martin store, which was a big barn of a building, used to house the Masonic organization upstairs, had a store that had a wonderful produce market, and the produce was brought in by Bill McCullough, who lived north of town. He was a remarkable gardener. The post office was also in that building. And next to that building was a building that was owned by a Mr. Watkins. And he had a similar store to Martin's store, but he also sold hunting equipment and a variety store like that. Then if you were to go on down the street from Martin's store, there had been a hotel at one time. It burned before my time. But then a big gas station was built there, a white gas station. And next to that was a place called Mink Clements. Mink had a gift store. He and his wife ran the store together. Mink was a gourmet cook, and no matter when I saw him, he told me a new recipe for something he had had. And next to them was a little eating place that the Clyde King and his wife had. It was just a sandwich and pie kind of shop and coffee. Then was Garby's Garage, and that was a rather big building. And next to that was the A&P store. Then it became Nelson's Drugstore, and now it's a dollar store, I believe. If you go out south on the streets where the Indian River Inn eventually developed, there was a boarding house owned by a Mr. and Mrs. Moore. They were a Polish couple. It was very hard to understand them, but I used to go in and visit with them. And I used to sell them arbutus, even though it was illegal to pick it now. We could pick it in my early days. And they took in the people who had come on the train who needed a place to stay overnight or needed a place to buy their breakfast. They had 3 children that I remember, Matilda, who was a little older than I, and Helen, who became a teacher, and a son, George, who was in grade school about the time I was. Now, I remember that Helen became a teacher in a rural school, and the kids must have been rather rough on her because she stayed only about a year and then went to a convent to become a nun. Next to Moore's restaurant, there was a little shop that sold braids and laces and other kinds of finery that women might want and would need to buy for their clothing. And next to that was a plumbing shop that was owned by a pair of relatives, Fisher and Zalman. And next to that was an old remnant of a hotel that in my day had become a bakery and also a place where you could go and buy illegal booze. Just beyond that was where McClutch's now sits. At one time, McClutch's store had been a cafe. Then next to that was Campbell's, then the town hall. I remember the year it burned. And then Jim Bell's house, and then Harry Dagwell's house. Ice cutting was a very interesting involvement. They cut the ice out in Burt Lake, hauled it into Fry's Ice House, and I think the Dagwells had an ice house too. And in the summer, they packed it in with sawdust. In the summertime, people came and got it. I've told you about the buildings on the west side of the highway. Now let's get to the east side of the highway at the lumberyard. It was managed by Roy Supinger, who moved up here from someplace in Ohio. And he lived in the house where Tex Maybank used to live. They welcomed all the kids in town. It was just like a teen town hall. The oldest of their 3 sons finally became mayor of Midland when I was living there. The township hall was an area rec house too. There were basketball games, movies, 4-H club, and you could fit it into half of the present town hall. And baseball diamond was donated by Charlie French. Now Charlie French owned what became Christopher's, and he married one of the Martin girls. He gave the property, which now holds a clinic for use as a baseball diamond. The King brothers, Peps and Stubb, Bert, Charlie, and Carl Dagwell, Russ Amiot, fellows from Afton, my brother Jim, who was a great athlete, John Casey from Melanson, Ted Garvey, a great catcher. There was no charge to these ball games. They just passed a hat. And it also attracted lots of Columbus Beach people. The golf course in the north end of town was erected about 1923. I caddied for people who came there from the Mullet Lake Village. And I knew many from the Columbus Beach side too, caddying for some of them. Of course, I also met them when I worked in Martin's store. Only a few men preferred to have someone else caddy for them, mainly Mert Wertheimer, who lived north of Topnabee and had his bodyguard along. Uncle Carl developed a golf course and was a greenskeeper and was also a good farmer. There were no organized activity for junior and senior highs, so we planned our own. There were popular games in the summertime. In winter, we hiked to the top of the Stone Road Hill, that's where the wigwam used to be, with our sled, and then we caught a ride with teams coming into town. And we did the same thing on the State Park Hill. The dead sturgeon was for skating. We built a fire in the dead stumps. Ice was elastic, waved up and down, hope you never got wet. One Christmas, Jim and I walked across the river beyond the Howe Marina to get our tree. Never remembered the river having been frozen over after that. We survived a scolding too. Skiing was done on the golf course and Columbus Beach Hill. We got new skis every Christmas. Always broke the pine skis. I recall eating much whitefish. They went spearing from a scow with a jackknife on it. You could see schools of fish plainly, and 3 to 5 pounders. Mother always had baked whitefish for us. Before I-75 and the airport were built, Leonard Dagwell used to bring me showy orchids from the swamp bordering the railroad tracks. The railroad tracks were useful. You could take a burlap bag, fill it with coal along the track as it spilled from the fireman when he was shoveling it. The coal heated our home along with our wood. In spring, the railroad tracks furnished wild strawberry vines. Mom and I used to pilgrimage these tracks for the berries for jam. That was a real strawberry jam. The road under the railroad track was the beginning of the Stone Road to Afton. Stone came from the Campbell Stone Quarry. The Campbells lived next to the property now owned by the Fletchy store. They had a son who became a corporate lawyer for Dow Chemical. I used to visit when his mother came there to live. When we were in the 9th and 10th grades, Dora Ballwright's mother used to invite us for an overnight at the White's farm. 5 girls. We slept crosswise on the bed. Forget about the quilts. Mrs. White made beauties. She also made a maple syrup cake. The next day we came home in a horse-drawn sleigh. My dad worked for the Department of Conservation in the state park. And many lasting friendships still have from those acquaintances, including a 100-year-old who came up in 1932. There were wooden coolers with icy well water running through them. They could be locked, but sometimes were broken into. People lived in tents. Sometimes they were slashed to try and get man's pants and a wallet. My dad was there until his retirement. Picking huckleberries was an interesting job in the late summer. We went by car past the Kohler Cemetery, took a lunch along, and took pails. We smelled smoke. We saw smoke. We went to the road. Coxie came through bringing Mrs. Jack Perry, giving her a ride to her farm. He took us back to our farm. This had been a crown fire. Jim and I used to have to go find the cows for evening milking, follow the tracks in the sand. The cows were in the old schoolhouse. Now, do you know where you are? I'm Zelda Cahill Davis Gilman.